She was forced to marry a cowboy as punishment, but at first sight she fell for him.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The sun over Arizona Territory in 1882 was a hard white glare that burned down on the courthouse steps, and the boards creaked under the weight of boots lined in a row. Men stood silent, hats low, dust clinging to their coats, waiting for the reading. A couple of women lingered in the shade of the mercantile, pretending to look at cloth bolts while listening to every word. The clerk cleared his throat, voice flat as he read from the folded paper in his hand. His tone carried the weight of authority, the kind that left no room for questions. By agreement of the Council of Elders and the town officers, the woman, known as Nullin of the Whitestone people, will be joined in lawful union to Elias Kane. The words ran long. For the restoration of peace between parties and the protection of this settlement from further discord. Elias Kane stood near the post at the bottom step, hands loose at his sides. He hadn't wanted this summons. When the deputy rode to his cabin 2 days ago, he nearly shut the door in his face. He'd left the law behind for a reason. 2 years without wearing a badge. 2 years trying to forget the crack of rifles and the way his brother bled out in his arms on a dirt street that smelled like gunpowder and whiskey. Now, they had his name on a piece of paper and expected him to take a woman like she was a bundle of trade goods. He hated the sound of it, but he also knew what would happen if he refused. She'd be given to someone worse. Maybe the same ranch hand who laughed when the deputy brought word, the kind who'd see her as property and break her for sport. He wasn't about to let that happen. He wasn't a good man, not by his own reckoning, but he wasn't cruel. Elias was 38, broad through the chest, his gray shirt worn thin at the elbows, suspenders tight over his shoulders. His coat was dark and carried the smell of sweat and horses. He wore his old revolver still, though the leather on the holster showed cracks from disuse. His ash-brown hair carried streaks of gray, his beard trimmed close. His eyes were the color of weathered steel, cold when they had to be, but sharp enough to catch what others missed. And now they were on her. Nullin stood on the courthouse steps, wrists bound in rawhide. Her head was high, chin cutting a hard line as if daring someone to call her weak. Her dress was a faded scrap of calico, torn down the shoulder and frayed at the hem. The neckline sagged loose, ripped from rough hands that hadn't cared if she was covered. Her hair, black and heavy, spilled down her back, strands stuck to the sweat on her skin. She was barefoot, the boards under her feet rough with splinters. 24 years old, punished for loving a man the world said she couldn't have. They called it a dishonor. They called her wild and defiant. Her people turned their faces away. The men in town looked at her like she was something for the taking. She hadn't spoken since they dragged her here. She wasn't going to beg. Shame burned in her gut, hot enough to make her throat tight. She hated the way their eyes crawled over her, hated the quiet like it was a noose tightening around her neck. Every muscle in her body was stiff with the effort not to tremble. When the clerk finished, the deputy stepped forward with the ledger and the pen. Elias stared at it a long second, jaw locked, before he reached out and scratched his name slow and neat across the page. He felt the eyes on his back, heard the murmur of boots shifting in the dirt behind him. The deputy shoved the pen toward her, but the clerk shook his head. No need. She's under binding order. Nullin's stomach turned. She heard that word, binding, and something in her chest felt like it might split. She wanted to spit at all of them, but she kept her face still, eyes fixed on the horizon. The deputy cut the rawhide from her wrists. The sting of the cut made her flinch, but she didn't rub the marks. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Elias stepped aside, motioned to the mule tied at the post. Come on. His voice was low, rough like gravel, but not unkind. No edge of mockery, no threat. She didn't answer, just walked, lifting her skirt clear of her ankles, and swung onto the saddle without help. The dress gaped at the torn shoulder as she moved, and she saw him notice. He said nothing. Elias mounted behind her, the saddle leather groaning under their weight. The sun hammered down as they rode west. Behind them, The courthouse shrank to a square of pale boards and then nothing but dust in the glare. Neither spoke for miles. Elias felt the heat coming off her through the thin dress. The tension wound tight in her spine. She didn't look back, didn't ask where they were going. He respected that. He didn't plan on talking either. When the ridge broke open and the scrub flats spread wide, his cabin showed. Low roof, lean-to on the side, smoke-blackened stovepipe leaning east. It wasn't much, just a square box against the emptiness. He slid down first, untied the mule, and led it to the post. She climbed down slow, eyes sweeping the yard. The broken fence rail near the corral, the stack of firewood split neat, the single water bucket hanging from peg. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and cold iron. One bed against the far wall, a stove in the corner, table scarred from years of elbows and knives. A single shelf held tin plates, a lamp, and a Bible with dust on its spine. Elias set his hat on the peg, loosened the strap of his holster, but didn't unbuckle it. There's water in the basin. Bread in the sack. You need more? I'll bring it. She turned her head, met his eyes for the first time. Dark, sharp eyes that said nothing but asked everything. He held the look for a moment, then glanced away. I'll sleep in the lean-to tonight. You take the bed. She didn't answer. He didn't wait. Just stepped out, pulling the door shut behind him. Nalin stood in the silence, the rope burns throbbing on her wrists, the weight of the day pressing down like the sun still burning on her skin. She pressed her palm flat to the table, felt the rough wood under her hand, and told herself she wasn't broken. Not yet. Outside, Elias leaned against the post, looking out toward the empty flats. He wondered how long it would take for both of them to hate this arrangement. He wondered if they'd survive the winter without tearing each other apart. But one thing he knew for certain, she'd be safe here, even if it cost him more than he was ready to give. The night closed in quick after sundown, cold seeping through the chinks of the walls as if the boards were paper. The little stove in the corner fought against it, throwing out a thin red glow. Nalin sat at the edge of the bed, fingers brushing over the coarse wool blanket. It smelled of cedar and old smoke. She hadn't eaten more than a crust of bread since morning, but hunger sat behind her chest, tangled up with everything else. Anger, shame, the sharp ache of being watched like a prize mule in town. She looked around the cabin in silence. It was rough, but not filthy, a man's place with no softness in it. The table scarred from years of knives. A single chair, nails on the wall where coats had hung. She wondered if there had ever been a woman here. The shelf held tin cups, a lamp, and a Bible thick with dust. Nothing else. Whoever Elias Kane was, he didn't carry clutter. She turned when the door opened and a draft slipped in around him. He stepped inside slow, a bucket in one hand, his coat still on, hat shadowing his face. His boots made a hollow thump on the boards as he crossed to the basin and poured water in, steam curling in the lamplight. Brought it up from the spring, he said. His voice was deep, the words plain, without sharpness. He set a rag beside the basin and nodded toward the table. There's jerky in the sack. Won't taste like much, but it'll fill you. Nalin didn't answer. Her throat was dry. She hated that her hands wanted to shake when she reached for the food. So she waited until he looked away, stripping off his gloves and hanging them on a peg. She tore off a piece of the jerky and chewed slow, tasting salt and smoke and leather on her tongue. Elias kept his back turned a long time, unbuckling his gun belt and laying it on the table with care. The metal clinked soft. He didn't want her thinking the worst. Not tonight. Not when she'd been handed over like stock at auction. But he kept it close enough to reach if trouble came. Trouble had a way of finding men who thought they'd left it behind. He pulled off his coat and draped it across the chair, then straightened and looked at her. Really looked this time. She was sitting stiff, shoulders drawn tight, her hair sliding forward like black rope, hiding half her face. The torn calico gaped at the neckline, thread fraying loose. It made something knot in his chest, a mix of anger and pity he didn't want to feel. You can wash up if you want, he said, tipping his chin toward the basin. Water's warm yet. She hesitated. Her eyes flicked from the cloth to him. Dark eyes, sharp, full of questions she wasn't speaking. Finally, she rose and stepped to the basin. The boards under her bare feet creaked. She wrung the rag slow, wiping the dirt from her arms, her throat, the curve of her collarbone. Elias forced his eyes away, staring at the firebox like it held something important. He told himself it was simple decency. She'd been hauled across 2 ridges, tied like an animal, paraded in front of men who grinned at her like wolves. She deserved a sliver of dignity, even here, even in this mess. When she finished, she set the rag down neat and turned. "Why you?" The words broke the quiet like a glass jar cracking on stone. Elias met her stare. "Didn't ask for it." "Then why?" Her voice was low, tight. He leaned his weight on the table, hands flat, calloused palms against the scarred wood. "Because if I didn't, someone else would have. Someone worse." The answer hung between them. She looked at him a long second, as if weighing the truth in it. Finally, she nodded once, the smallest dip of her chin, and walked back to the bed. She didn't lie down, just sat, elbows on her knees, fingers laced, like a soldier waiting for orders. Elias stepped to the door and opened it, cold rushing in around his boots. "I'll be in the lean-to. You need anything, knock once." He paused, hand on the frame. Door locked from the inside. That made her look up. For the first time since they left town, something in her face shifted, just a flicker, a shadow of relief crossing the hard line of her mouth. She gave no word, but her eyes said enough. He stepped out and shut the door. The latch clicked, solid. Outside, the night smelled of dust and cedar smoke. He leaned against the post, drawing a long breath. The sky was wide and black, stars hard as nails. In the cabin, Nalin slid the bolt across and sat still, listening to the wind at the eaves. Her wrists ached where the rope had bit, and when she closed her eyes, she saw the faces from the courthouse, the clerk, the elders, the men in the back with their smirks. She hated all of them, hated the helplessness burning in her chest. But for the first time in days, no one could touch her. No one could drag her anywhere. That was something. She lay back slow, pulling the blanket up to her chin. The bed smelled faintly of cedar and man's sweat. She breathed in deep, steady, until her heartbeat eased. Outside, Elias shifted his shoulders against the post and wondered if he'd made the worst choice of his life, or the one thing that might set something right. The sun came up pale behind a low stretch of cloud, laying gray light across the flats. Elias woke early, as he always did, with the air sharp in his lungs and the smell of cedar, smoke clinging to his coat. He rolled off the pallet in the lean-to, brushed the frost off his boots, and stepped inside the cabin without knocking. He wasn't sure if she'd locked the door, but he'd left her the bolt for her peace of mind, and she had slid it. That said something. He unlatched it slow, careful not to startle her. The hinge gave a soft groan as the door swung in. The stove still held a bed of coals, thin orange glow in the dark. Nalin was sitting on the edge of the bed, hair loose down her back, hands busy twisting the wool blanket into a tight roll. When she looked up, her eyes were level and guarded. But he noticed the tension wasn't as raw as last night. "I'll put on coffee," he said, voice even. She didn't answer, only moved to the side so he could pass. He set the kettle on, fed a stick of kindling to the firebox, and watched it catch. Silence filled the space, heavy but not hostile. Outside, the wind tugged at the walls, and the sound of the mule shifting came faint through the boards. Nalin pulled her braid over one shoulder, fingers working fast, and he saw the marks on her wrist where the rope had bit deep. Dark bruises like shackles. Something twisted in him, sharp enough that he turned his face away, jaw tightening. This wasn't her fault, and yet the law had dressed it up like justice. He wondered how many men in that crowd last night had grinned because they thought she was theirs in some way. The thought made his stomach go hard. When the kettle began to whisper, he poured 2 tin cups and slid one across the table. She hesitated, then reached out and took it. Her fingers brushed his for a second, warm skin against calloused knuckle, and both of them stilled like it mattered more than it should. Then she set the cup near her lap and stared into the steam. "You hungry?" he asked. "I ate last night," she said. Her voice was low, words shaped with care, like each one cost her something. He believed her, but she looked hollow. He tore a strip of jerky anyway, laid it on the table, and left it there. She didn't touch it, not yet. The silence stretched, and then she said, almost sharp, "What do you want from me?" Elias leaned his hip against the counter, arms folded. Nothing. He let it hang there before adding, "You weren't given to me for that." Her eyes narrowed. "Then why keep me?" He shrugged one shoulder, slow. "Because leaving you, there wasn't an option." That's it. She studied him long, as if trying to find the lie, but there wasn't one. Finally, she nodded once, short and hard, then looked away. By mid-morning, the wind came strong from the north, slamming grit against the cabin walls. Elias pulled on his coat and said he had a fence rail to set before it split in two. She didn't answer, just sat with her hands folded in her lap. He reached for his gloves and hesitated at the door. "If you're cold, burn more wood. There's a stack by the stove." When he stepped out, the wind cut his face raw, but he welcomed the sting. Work kept his head steady. He drove the post into the ground with the flat of the axe and tamped the dirt down hard. By the time he came back, his coat was dusted white with frost. The door opened before he could knock. She stood there, dress mended in a rough stitch where it had torn across the shoulder. He saw the needle and thread still on the table, the spool almost gone because she'd pulled strand from the hem to make do. She'd swept the floor, too. Boards were clean, dust pushed in neat lines. The jerky was gone. That, more than anything, settled something inside him. He stomped his boots off and came in. "Wind's bad," he said. "Roof might loosen if it keeps up." His eyes flicked to the patched dress again. "That hole, for now," she said, fingers brushing the seam like she wasn't sure if it was worth mentioning. Then, after a beat, "You have more cloth?" He nodded. "Some calico. Never used it." He reached for the shelf, pulled down a folded strip wrapped in paper, and set it on the table. "Might be enough for sleeves." She unwrapped it slow, smoothing the fabric with her palms. Her hands were small, quick, the nails cut blunt from work. She didn't thank him, but her shoulders eased a little, and that was better than words. They spent the next hour in silence, him sorting nails for the roof job, her stitching the new sleeves. Now and then, their eyes met across the table. No words, just a quiet acknowledgement that neither of them had walked away. By evening, the wind died, leaving a cold blue hush over the flats. He set a pot of beans on the stove and broke a chunk of salt pork into it. When he slid a bowl toward her, she didn't refuse. She ate slow, careful like someone who didn't trust the ground under her feet yet, but who wanted to. Elias watched without making it a stare, then looked at the fire instead. When the meal was done, he stood, reaching for his coat. "I'll check the mule, then turn in." He paused at the door. "Bolt the latch if you want." This time, her voice came soft but clear. "You don't have to sleep outside." He froze, his back to her, breath caught in his throat for a beat too long. Then he nodded once, slow. "I'll keep the floor." She didn't argue, didn't look away either. The firelight played across her face, and in that quiet, something between them shifted, small but real. Morning broke sharp and cold, the kind that made every sound carry. Elias stepped out early to check the sky. Thin clouds drifting low over the flats, wind from the north. Snow wasn't likely yet, but the air held that weight, like the season was warning him it wouldn't wait long. He tightened his coat and scanned the corral before heading back inside. The cabin was warmer than he left it. Nalin was at the table, her back straight, hair braided down her spine, the patched dress fitting tighter now that she'd added sleeves. She was working with what little she had, cutting the remaining calico into strips for a second layer. The spool of thread was nearly gone. Her hands moved fast, neat, like she'd done this all her life. Elias noticed the marks on her wrists were fading, but still raw. He didn't speak of it, just filed it away with the other things he wouldn't forget. "I'll ride to town," he said, setting his gloves on the table. "We need flour, more cloth, and coffee. You need anything else?" She looked up, dark eyes steady. "Needles. Stronger thread." Her voice was firm this time. Not a question, not hesitant. It made him nod once without thinking. He poured water into the kettle and set it on the stove. "Won't take long," he said. "If someone gives you trouble while I'm gone." "I can handle trouble," she cut in, a sharp edge under the calm. Elias studied her a moment. She meant it. He didn't doubt her grit, But grit wouldn't stop a man with bad intentions if he came through that door. He pushed the thought down and said only, "Bolt the latch till I'm back." He left on the mule, coat collar turned up against the wind. The ride to town was quiet except for the hum of his own thoughts. Folks would talk. They always did. He could already hear it. Questions about the Apache woman in his cabin, whispers about whether he'd gone soft or savage. He didn't give a damn, but he didn't want her hearing it. She'd borne enough humiliation to last a lifetime. The store was half full when he got there. Elias stepped inside, dust shaking from his coat, and felt the eyes cut his way. The clerk straightened behind the counter, lips pressed tight. Elias kept his voice even slow. "Flour, coffee, 2 spools of thread, needles, calico if you've got any left." Coins clinked on the counter. The clerk hesitated, then moved to fill the order. Conversation in the back slowed to a hush, like men waiting to see if he'd bite. He didn't. He tied the bundle to the saddle and rode home without looking back. When he reached the ridge, the sky was bruised purple with a dying sun. Smoke rose from the stovepipe, steady, not frantic. That eased something in him. He swung down, boots crunching on frost, and carried the bundle inside. Nalin was at the stove, stirring a pot that smelled of beans and onion. The room felt warmer than it ever had, maybe because the shadows were softer now, stretched long across the floor instead of clinging to the corners. She turned when he came in, eyes flicking to the bundle in his arms. He sat on the table and untied the string, laying out the goods. Flour, coffee, cloth, thread, needles. Her gaze landed on the calico. Deep russet, the last piece the store had, he figured. Her fingers hovered before she touched it, smoothing the fabric like it was something rare. She didn't smile, but her shoulders eased a fraction, and that was enough for him. "Thank you," she said, quiet but clear. He nodded, pulling off his coat. "Got what you asked for. Figured you'd need it." He didn't mention the stairs in town, didn't tell her about the way men muttered under their breath. No point bringing that poison through the door. They ate in near silence, the only sound the scrape of spoons and the pop of the stove. When the bowls were empty, she rose to clear the table, but the movement tugged the neckline of her patched dress, and the seam split with a sudden tear. She froze, cloth bunching under her fingers, a flush creeping up her throat. Elias saw it happen and stood before he could think. "Hold still," he said. His tone was calm, like giving orders on a trail drive, but his pulse hit harder than it should. He took the needle and thread from the bundle and moved close, close enough to see the rise and fall of her breath. Her hair brushed his arm as he worked, stitching the gap in small, steady passes. His fingers grazed her skin more than once, not by design, but because the fabric was thin and the rip ran deep. Each time, he felt the warmth of her, and each time, he forced his jaw tighter, his eyes on the thread. Nalin stood silent, head slightly bowed, watching his hands. No man had ever touched her like this, careful without claiming. It unsettled her more than roughness ever could. She kept her breathing even, though her heart thudded like hoofbeats. When he tied the last knot, Elias stepped back quick, giving her space. "That'll hold," he said, voice rougher than before. She touched the seam, fingers tracing the neat line. Then her gaze lifted to his face, dark eyes holding his like they wanted something he couldn't name. The air between them felt charged, stretched thin. Elias cleared his throat, reached for his coat. "Storm coming by tomorrow. We'll need more wood." He moved toward the door like a man breaking a spell, leaving her standing there with the calico in her hands and a heat in her chest she didn't understand yet. Outside, the wind carried the smell of snow. Inside, the fire burned steady, throwing light across the table where the cloth lay waiting, bright against the rough wood, like a promise neither of them spoke. The storm came in before daylight, a wall of gray sweeping across the flats with wind that carried needles of ice. By dawn, the cabin walls were groaning under its weight, the chinks whistling where the mud had cracked. Elias had been right. Snow this early meant a hard winter ahead. He rose before first light, stoked the stove until the iron glowed, then hauled in the last armful of wood stacked under the lean-to. When the door slammed shut behind him, The sound vanished into the roar outside, like the whole world had gone white and wild beyond those thin boards. Nalin was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, her blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. Her hair was loose this time, spilling down like a dark sheet, and her bare feet curled against the plank floor. She watched him set the logs by the hearth, his shoulders stiff under the weight, the snow melting on his coat and dripping down to the boards. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough," he said. He stripped off his gloves, flexing fingers that had gone red from cold. "We stay until it passes. Could be a day, could be 3. Her brow furrowed, but she nodded. No fear in her face, only calculation. She had lived through worse storms in the mountains, but never in a cabin with a man who wasn't hers, never with walls this thin and silence this sharp. He moved to the table, set down the sack he'd brought from the lean-to. A few carrots, 2 onions, salt pork, flour, and a twist of cloth. "We make it stretch," he said. "After this blows out, I'll hunt." She rose, bare feet padding quiet across the floor, and began sorting the food without asking. The way her hands worked, quick, steady, almost graceful, made something ease in him. She didn't wait to be told. She didn't act beaten. She acted like someone who still had purpose, and for some reason, that settled him more than anything. By midday, the cabin was warm from the stove and heavy with the smell of simmering beans. Snow drove against the windows in waves, hissing like dry sand. The walls creaked. They ate sitting close to the fire, tin bowls balanced in their hands. Elias caught her glancing toward the door more than once, as if measuring what stood between her and that white hell outside. "You been through storms like this?" he asked. "Yes." Her voice was even. "Higher up, in the hills." She blew on her spoon and added, "With family." He nodded once, chewing slow. He didn't ask what happened to them. Not yet. When the bowls were empty, she rose to rinse them in the basin. The water was cold, but she didn't flinch. Elias watched her from his chair, the way her shoulders squared under that thin patched dress, the way she moved like someone who carried the weight of pride even when the world tried to strip it. "Here," he said, standing. "Let me." She shook her head without looking back. "I can do it." He let her. Later, while the wind screamed through the flats, he climbed the stool and checked the roof planks for loosened nails. She steadied the stool without being asked, one hand wrapped firm around the rung. Her face tilted up, eyes following his work. "Why'd you leave the law?" The question came sudden, cutting through the hammer's rhythm. Elias stilled, looking down at her. For a long moment, only the storm answered. Then he said, "Because a badge can't stop a bullet. Found that out the day my brother died." His jaw flexed once hard. "I was holding him when it happened." Nalin's fingers tightened on the stool. She didn't speak, but something in her gaze shifted. Less ice, more understanding. He climbed down slow, boots thudding against the boards. She didn't step back. For the first time since this started, they stood close enough for the firelight to draw their shadows together on the wall. "You hate this," he said quietly. Not a question, just truth laid bare. Her eyes held his. "I hate what they did. Not you." The words landed heavier than she meant, and she looked away fast, fingers twisting the hem of her patched sleeve. Elias felt the weight of them settle in his chest, warm and dangerous. When night came, the storm raged harder, turning the windows blind with white. The cold pushed in through every seam, and the fire couldn't keep up. Elias threw on his coat and rolled his blanket on the floor near the hearth. But Nalin stood watching him, her face caught between resolve and something else. "It's too cold for the floor," she said. Her voice was calm, but her hands tightened on the back of the chair. "The bed's wide." Elias looked at her a long moment, searching for anything forced in those words. There was none, only choice. He nodded once. "All right, I'll keep to my side." She didn't smile, didn't blush, just turned down the blanket and lay with her back to the wall. When he lay beside her, the heat of her body seeped through the thin space between them. And for the first time in a long time, Elias felt something loosen deep inside, something he'd thought was gone. Neither spoke. The storm hammered, the stove ticked, and in that silence, something began to settle. Not duty, not law, but the first quiet shape of belonging. The second day of the storm broke darker than the first. The light outside was gray and flat, as if the sun hadn't bothered to rise. The wind had shifted in the night, now screaming against the north wall, rattling the shutters until the nails whined. Snow was stacked deep across the step. Elias could feel the weight of it pressing against the door. When he tested the latch, the wood groaned but held. They weren't going anywhere. He turned back to the room, rubbing heat into his fingers. The fire was alive but greedy, eating through the last split logs stacked by the stove. "We've got maybe one more day of wood inside," he said. "After that, I'll need to dig out and haul more." Nalin sat on the edge of the bed, her braid loose from sleep, strands falling against her cheeks. She glanced toward the door, then back at him. "You'll freeze out there." "I've done worse," he said, his tone quiet, not boasting. He pulled on his coat, but didn't reach for his boots yet. "Wait until the wind dies," she said, firm enough to make him pause. It struck him. The way she said it, like her word carried weight. Like she wasn't asking, she was deciding. For a moment, he let that stand. The kettle hissed, sending curls of steam into the air. He poured water over coffee grounds in the tin pot, the bitter scent filling the cabin. She moved behind him without a sound, setting the last onion and a strip of salt pork on the table. Her hands were pale against the dark wood, nails trimmed neat. Elias noticed how steady they were now, not the tight fists from the first night. They ate late, sharing cornbread so dry it clung to their throats, washing it down with coffee that burned more than it warmed. When the meal ended, silence settled heavy. Not the stiff kind from before. This one felt waiting. Nalin pulled the russet calico from the shelf and laid it across her lap, the needle flashing in and out as she worked. Her fingers moved with quick certainty, but he saw the rough patches, thread too thin, fabric too soft to last. He sat across from her, cleaning his rifle out of habit, though he hadn't loaded it in months. The scrape of the rod in the barrel and the hiss of thread through cloth made a strange kind of rhythm in the room. "Why'd you never marry before?" Her voice cut through the quiet like a clear note. Not sharp, just sudden. Elias froze, the cloth in his hand going still. He lifted his gaze, meeting hers across the table. For a second, the wind filled the silence between them. Then he said, "Didn't suit me." He turned the rifle slow, ran the cloth down the barrel. "Life I had, law work, wasn't steady. Didn't seem fair to ask any woman to live with the kind of trouble that followed me." "And now?" she asked, eyes holding as like she was measuring more than words. He set the rifle aside, leaning forward on his elbows. "Now I got a roof. Land. Trouble's still out there, but it doesn't knock on my door anymore." His jaw tightened a fraction. "Didn't think I'd need more than that." Nalin looked down at the fabric, smoothing it with her palm. "Maybe you didn't." Her voice was low, but he caught the weight in it, the hint that maybe she understood what he hadn't said. By late afternoon, the wind shifted again, driving the snow hard against the roof. Shadows grew long. The cabin tightened around them like a fist. Elias fed the fire and watched her in the glow, the heat throwing a soft sheen across her skin. She had stripped off the patched outer dress to work in her underlayer, still modest, but worn thin from years of use. The neckline dipped loose, gaping when she bent to lift the basket of mending. He looked away, jaw clenched, and cursed himself for noticing. When he turned back, she was standing closer than before, holding out the newly pieced dress. "It'll fit better now," she said. He nodded, his throat dry. "Looks good. Can you?" She hesitated, then turned, lifting her braid clear. The back ties were stiff, hard to reach with the new seams. Elias stood slowly, his boots sounding heavy on the planks. He took the ties in his hands, fingers brushing the warm skin at the base of her neck. She smelled faintly of smoke and something softer he couldn't name. He pulled the ties snug, working careful, every nerve in him awake. When he finished, his hands lingered for a breath too long, and when she turned, their faces were closer than they'd ever been. Neither moved. The fire popped, loud in the silence. Her eyes held his, dark, searching, not afraid. Elias swallowed hard. "Nalin." Her name felt strange and steady on his tongue. She didn't answer with words. Her fingers touched his wrist, light as breath, then slid up to his shoulder. That was all it took to break the wall between them. He bent, slow enough to stop if she flinched. She didn't. Their mouths met soft, hesitant at first, then deeper when her hand curled at the back of his neck. Heat surged through him, fierce and clean, like something long buried had come alive. When they parted, her breath trembled against his cheek. His hand stayed at her waist, steadying them both. "We don't have to rush this," he said, voice low, rough. Her eyes lifted, dark and certain. "I know." He kissed her again, slower this time, and when they broke apart, he stepped back, forcing air into his lungs. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the air felt warmer, the fire throwing light that reached every corner. They didn't speak of what came next. They didn't need to. The silence said enough, that what began as a punishment was turning into something neither of them could walk away from now. By the third morning, the storm broke. The wind fell quiet, leaving the world muffled under a weight of white so bright it hurt the eyes. The cabin felt warmer than before, the fire slow in the stove, smoke curling lazy through the stovepipe. Elias stepped to the door and shouldered it open against the drift. Cold air swept in, sharp enough to sting the lungs. Beyond the threshold, the flats stretched silent, fence rails buried, the corral gate half gone under a mound of snow. He pulled on his boots, tugged his coat tight. "I'll dig the trough for the mule, cut a path to the woodpile." Nalin was wrapping the last of the calico into a cloth bundle, her braids swinging low over her shoulder. She glanced up. "I'll help." "No," he said, voice low but firm. "You stay warm. I don't need you freezing out there." Her jaw set. "I've worked through worse winters." The edge of her voice made him pause, a reminder she wasn't a woman bred to sit idle while a man broke his back. He hesitated, then nodded once. "Put on the boots by the door, and take my spare coat." Minutes later, they stepped out together, breath steaming in the still air. The snow reached her knees in places, but she didn't falter, her skirts dragging wet along the drifts. Elias handed her a shovel and broke the first cut himself, steel biting into packed ice. She fell in behind him, clearing the shoveled paths with swift, strong strokes. Watching her work, the precision, the quiet endurance, stirred something old in him, something that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with respect. When the trough was clear and the mule watered, he saw color high in her cheeks, her dark hair tangled against the collar of his coat. She met his look, breathless but steady, and for a second the cold between them wasn't cold at all. By midday, the sun burned off the last of the gray, throwing knives of light across the snow. Elias stacked wood inside, then built a second stack under the eaves. When he came back in, stamping ice from his boots, Nalin was by the stove, setting out the last of the beans and a heel of bread on the table. Her hands were red from the cold, and without thinking he caught them between his, rubbing heat into her fingers. She froze, eyes on his, and the air thickened in that small room. He felt her pulse leap under his thumbs, fast and sure. His own wasn't much steadier. Slowly, he let go, though every part of him fought to hold on. "Thank you," she said, voice low, almost unsteady. He stepped back, cleared his throat. "After we eat, I've got a ride into town. Folks'll wonder if we're still breathing." Her gaze sharpened at that. "You think they'll come?" He shook his head, though the truth was heavier. "Don't give them reason to. But talk runs fast. I'd rather set things straight before someone else tries." The words seemed to settle on her like a weight. She nodded, quiet, and turned back to the stove. The ride to town was slow, snow crusting under the mule's hooves. Elias kept his collar high, eyes on the frozen road. The store was crowded when he pushed through the door, men warming their hands, boots propped on the stove, voices cutting short the moment they saw him. "Storm treat you all right, Kane?" one asked, grin sharp enough to slice. Elias let the question hang, then said flat, "Cabin held fine." He bought flour, salt, and lamp oil, counting out coins with steady hands. When another man muttered something low about Apache women knowing how to keep a bed warm, Elias turned slow, his stare hard as frost. "You got something worth saying? Say it where I can hear it clear." His voice didn't rise, but the room went still all the same. The man shifted in his boots, eyes sliding away. No one spoke after that. By the time Elias rode home, the sky was dark and full of stars. The cabin glowed faint through the snow, a square of gold in the white silence. He pushed the door open and stepped in a heat that felt like a second skin. Nalin was at the table, her hair loose, the lamplight painting her face in warm shadow. She looked up, eyes holding his, and something in his chest eased like a knot worked loose. "Any trouble?" she asked. "Not worth naming," he said, setting the sack on the table. He shrugged off his coat, flexed the stiffness from his fingers, and crossed to the stove. The smell of rabbit stew filled the room, rich, earthy, warm. "You caught this." He glanced at her. "Snare by the fence," she said simply. He stared for a second, then nodded once, pride tightening his throat. "Good work." They ate by the fire, the silence between them softer than any words. When the bowls were empty, she rose to clear them, but he caught her wrist. Not hard, just enough to make her stop. She turned, and there was again that heat pulling like a tide. He stood, slow, and closed the space between them. This time, there was no hesitation. His mouth found hers, deep and sure, and her hands lifted to his shoulders, pulling him closer. The taste of her was salt and smoke and something sweeter that undid him from the inside out. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "You still want this?" His voice was rough, scraped raw by more than cold. "Yes," she said without flinch. "I want to stay." The words hit him like a shot through the dark, clean and final. Whatever law or ledger had tied them before, this was different. This was choice. He kissed her again, slow this time, the fire painting their shadows long across the walls. Outside, the snow lay silent, the night deep and still. Inside, the cabin felt less like a refuge and more like the start of something neither of them could have imagined when this began. The days after the storm passed with a strange calm. The snow crusted hard across the flats, glittering under a pale sun, and the cold held steady, biting through every seam of the cabin walls. Elias worked to clear the yard, chopping a path to the woodpile and hauling in enough logs to last a week. Nalin moved between the stove and the table, stitching what she could from the russet calico, mending seams until her fingers ached. They barely spoke some hours, but the silence between them wasn't brittle anymore. It carried a weight that felt almost solid, shared like the walls that kept the cold out. By the fourth morning, the quiet broke with the crunch of hooves outside. Elias was by the door in 2 strides, rifle in hand before the second knock came. When he pulled it open, the cold burst in along with the sight of 2 elders on horseback and a man from town standing between them, his coat buttoned high, a tin star glinting on his chest. Elias stepped into the threshold, body filling the doorway. "Morning," he said flatly. The deputy nodded, eyes flicking past Elias into the cabin where Nalin stood by the table, her hands still on the spool of thread. Her chin lifted, defiance hard in her dark eyes. But Elias saw the flicker of something else, anger edged with dread. She'd known this was coming. "We need to speak," the deputy said. "About the arrangement." "Arrangement's fine," Elias replied. His voice was calm, but there was steel under it. One of the elders spoke then, his hair gray and braided, his words thick with an accent that carried the mountains in it. "She was punished. That punishment is done. We take her back now." Elias stepped out onto the porch, boots grinding into the crusted snow. "No," he said. The deputy's jaw tightened. "This isn't a choice for you, Kane. This was a council order, not a marriage by consent." Elias's fingers curled around the stock of his rifle. "You think I'd force her?" His voice stayed low, but the edge cut sharp as a blade. He turned his head toward Nalin then, eyes locking with hers. "Tell them." She moved forward, slow and steady, bare feet whispering over the plank floor. When she reached the doorway, the wind whipped her braid across her shoulder, but her chin didn't dip. Her voice carried clear and cold across the yard. "I'm not leaving." The elder's eyes narrowed. "You shame us more with this choice." Her hands clenched at her sides, but she didn't look away. What shamed me was being given like a horse, she said. That's done. You can't take me twice. The deputy shifted, uncomfortable, but he held his ground. Nalin, the counsel. She stays. Elias cut in, his voice quiet but final. If you want to drag her out, you'll have to go through me. His stare pinned the man like nails through timber. You really want that fight? For what? So you can tell folks a woman's got no right to her own word. The silence stretched long, broken only by the wind cutting through the flats. Finally, the elder pulled on his reins, his jaw hard as stone. Then she's no longer of our people. Nalin's breath hitched sharp in the cold, but she didn't flinch. Then I'm his, she said. Her voice shook once, then steadied. By choice. Elias's chest tightened with something fierce and clean. The deputy muttered under his breath, turned his horse, and the three of them rode off across the snow, their shapes shrinking into the horizon. When the sound of hooves faded, Elias turned to her. For a moment, neither spoke. Her face was pale against the wind, lips drawn tight, eyes burning with a mix of victory and grief. He stepped closer, his hand rising slow until it rested against her cheek. She leaned into it without a word, like the fight had drained everything else out of her. Inside, the fire burned low. He shut the door against the cold, drew her close, and felt her hands clutch his coat like an anchor in deep water. She wasn't shaking, not yet, but her breath came fast against his neck. They won't come back, he said softly. Not after that. I know. Her voice was raw, then quieter. It still hurts. I know that too. They stood that way a long time, the silence broken only by the crack of ice sliding off the roof. When she finally pulled back, her eyes searches like she was making sure he was still there, still real. Whatever she found made her mouth soften, her hand lifting to rest against his jaw. You meant it, she said. Not a question. Every word, he answered. That night, the cabin glowed with lamplight, shadows flickering against the walls as the fire roared hotter than it had all winter. They ate together, close enough their arms brushed, and later, when the dishes were cleared and the wind eased into a low hum, he kissed her slow. No rush, no taking, just the weight of two lives binding like knots in rope. When they lay down, her head rested against his shoulder, and for the first time since the day they tied her wrists, she felt free. Spring came slow to the flats, peeling winter back in layers. First the wind softened, then the snow turned to crust, then to mud that sucked at boots and mule hooves. By late March, the ground showed patches of brown, and shoots of green pushed up where the soil stayed warm longest. For Elias and Nalin, the passing of winter didn't just feel like a season shifting. It felt like something breaking loose inside them, a weight that had been pressing since the day they rode from the courthouse. The cabin smelled of fresh-cut boards that morning. Elias stood outside, driving nails into a new frame, shaping what would become a small pen for chickens. Sweat ran cold down his back, but his arms worked steady, swinging the hammer with the kind of focus that made his jaw tight. He wasn't thinking about chickens. Not really. He was thinking about the papers folded in his coat pocket. The one signed yesterday in front of a judge who had stared over his glasses and asked the question straight. Is this marriage by consent? Elias had looked at her, and she had answered before he could open his mouth. Yes, by choice. Her voice hadn't shaken. Now those papers were done, ink dry. Whatever law or gossip might say, no one could tear her from him again. Inside, Nalin knelt by the table, pressing seeds into small cloth bundles for the garden, rows they'd lay as soon as the ground softened. Her hair was braided tight, beads flashing where they caught the sun through the open door. She wore the dress she'd pieced together through the winter, neat seams strong under her fingers. It fit her now, not like something borrowed, but something hers. Her wrists bore no scars, only thin pale lines that would fade by summer. Every so often, she glanced toward the doorway where Elias worked, her chest rising with a slow breath she hadn't known how to take months ago. By midday, they ate together on the porch step, plates balanced on their knees, fried rabbit, coarse bread, the first greens from a patch near the creek. They didn't speak much. They didn't have to. Words had never built this life. Hands had. Swinging an axe, sewing a seam, carrying water when the wind burned the skin raw. That was what bound them tighter than any vow. When the plates were cleared, Elias went inside and came back with something wrapped in a square of sackcloth. He sat beside her, his big hands turning the bundle slow before setting it in her lap. She unwrapped it careful, fingers brushing over smooth wood carved into the shape of a cradle board. The edges were sanded clean, the strap strong, the surface marked with simple lines. His mark cut deep like it belonged there. Her throat tightened. "You think I'm—" She broke off, eyes flicking up to his. Dark, steady, searching. "Not yet," he said softly. "But someday. Thought it ought to be ready when the time comes." Her breath hitched, something warm rolling through her chest that felt like sunlight breaking after a long storm. She traced the grain with her fingertips, then looked at him again. "You want that? I want every damn part of this," Elias said, voice low and certain. "Not because of what they made us do. Because I choose it now. Every day." The words landed heavy and right, and for the first time since that day on the courthouse steps, her eyes filled, not with shame, not with rage, but something gentler. She leaned in, slow but sure, and kissed him. There was nothing hurried in it, nothing stolen. It was the kind of kiss that felt like planting something deep where no frost could reach. When they parted, the air between them held steady like the earth after rain. She pressed her forehead to his and whispered, "Then I'm yours. Not because of papers. Because I want to be." He closed his eyes, his hand cupping the back of her neck. "That's all I ever needed." As the sun dropped behind the ridge, throwing the flats in gold, Elias set the cradle board inside the cabin and returned to where she stood barefoot in the mud, pressing seeds into the dark soil. He came up behind her, slid his arms around her waist, and held her while the evening wind moved through the cottonwoods. For a long time, they just stayed that way, two silhouettes against the wide, open land that had seen every kind of cruelty and now maybe a little grace. The world beyond might keep its talk. Let it. Their roof was tight, their ground was ready, and the life they had wasn't bound by punishment anymore. It was theirs, built from choice, carved from winter, rooted in the quiet promise of spring.